Hello and welcome to the Dissect and Connect podcast. I'm your host, Mike Wade. This is the podcast where we explore population health issues impacting your community. The Dissect and Connect podcast is a service of Montgomery County Prevention Partners and New River Valley Community Services. Our podcast is made possible through a grant from Carilion Clinic. The views expressed in this podcast may not necessarily reflect the views of Carilion Clinic. James Pritchett has been with New River Valley Community Services since 2006 and has served as the agency's executive director since 2017. He earned his undergraduate degree from Wingate University and holds a master's of social work degree from Radford University. A resident of the New River Valley since 1999, James has vast professional experience in direct service and program management in both the public and private sectors. Aside from being a licensed clinical social worker, James is also a certified prevention professional, and he holds a certification in critical incident stress management. James has served on the board of the Women's Resource Center of the New River Valley since 2018. So James, welcome to the Dissect and Connect podcast.
Thank you, Mr. Wade. I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. Good to talk to you. So, if you've listened to our podcast any at all the last month or two, you know that the first question I always ask of our guests is, how have you personally been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic?
Wow, that's such a loaded question. On many levels, I feel like, I've been impacted personally and, of course, professionally. There's been a lot of challenges, and I will admit the first 2 months were a bit of a struggle trying to figure out how to meet the needs of our community and the people we serve, as well as address the concerns and fears of the staff that work here.
Well, how about on a personal level?
On a personal level, I think like most people, I've struggled with, the uncertain times and the challenges. What does this mean for me and my family and those close to me? And how do I connect with them? How do I sleep at night? How do I go about my daily activities since my routine has been changed so much?
I think that's true for a lot of us.
I agree.
What's something about NRVCS that most of our listeners might be surprised to learn?
When I'm out in the community, listening to individuals, listening to heads of different organizations, I'm always surprised when they make the comment, "Oh, I didn't realize you guys did that," or "I didn't realize you offered that service." Our agency offers, I'm going to say, 40 different programs, and they're all geared toward folks struggling with behavioral health issues. We try to tailor our programs to meet the needs of the community, as well as those individuals, those citizens living in our area. So it's pretty common for us to develop a new program and then someone out in the community say, "Oh, you guys do that?" Well, yes, we do. So I think just the breadth and variety of programming that we offer is a shock to some people. I'm sure you're aware, most folks know that we offer and run the community transit system as well as the Radford transit system. And so folks will say, how does a behavioral health organization get into transportation? Well, again, trying to meet the needs of our community and being a provider of behavioral health services in a rural environment, a lot of our folks struggle with getting to appointments.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I think the surprise is always, you guys do that?
Yeah, heard that a lot over the years. I wanted to ask, and you and I have known each other for a long time, and I don't guess I've ever asked you this question. Why did you choose this field as a career?
Wow, getting philosophical early in the morning here. I used to joke with people and say, when you have a father who's a minister and a mother who's a school teacher, this is what you get. You get a social worker. I feel very lucky, privileged, and honored to be able to carry out my personal philosophy on life every day. I mean, my belief is we are here to serve and meet the needs of our our neighbors, those around us, and I get to carry that out every day. I'm pretty fortunate.
Yeah, that's great. So I mentioned in the introduction that you've been with the agency for about 15 years now. I was curious if you could give some perspective on how things have changed in the 15 years that you've been with NRVCS.
Change happens slowly and change happens quickly, all at the same time.
Very true.
When I started here, working for New River Valley Community Services, I think there might have been around 300, 400 staff members at that time. And now we're pushing 850 to 900 staff.
Yeah.
And so just the growth in programming, staff has been enormous. And I chalk that up to us continually striving to meet the needs out there of our community. Some of the changes in behavioral health care have impacted how we work. And what I mean by that is, we are constantly trying to figure out how to fund the programs that we deliver. A lot of individuals out there are unaware that most of our funding we generate ourselves, and we generate that by billing insurance company. We do that in a manner to obviously provide those services, but those funds that come in to pay for those services allow us to continually expand and meet the needs of the indigent population. So every dollar that we earn, we sustain ourselves with it, but we also try to develop new programs. The managed care system has really impacted how we do business. It's changed anything from how we assess people to how we apply for authorizations to be reimbursed for that service. And I would say one of the biggest challenges that we've struggled with over the last, I'm going to say 10 years, has been the extra cost to provide a service. And what I mean by that is there's a lot more administrative work that goes on behind the scenes to provide that service. And we have to provide those administrative services in order to meet the demands of the managed care organizations. And so that's been a struggle, trying to make sure that we have that in place so we can sustain the services, so we can work with the managed care organizations in order to, meet the needs of the community and meet our own needs.
What's something that you've learned or gained in your time with NRVCS?
I've learned so much. I think we constantly are challenged to learn and grow, no matter how long we've been with an organization and no matter how old we are. That's a continuing process. Personally, I've learned the value of working collaboratively with members of our community. A lot of the different organizations that we come in contact with every day, we share the same clients. We try to provide services to the same people. So it's really important that we understand what their goals are, what their mission is, and how they deliver and approach individuals in our community so we can partner with them to better serve folks, to make sure that there's no gaps. And I think especially during times when budgets are tight and funding for different organizations and systems in our community are stretched and stressed, that collaboration is very important. I think most of what we do as far as trying to provide outreach in our community, make sure individuals have access to care, is a product of our collaborations.
Takes a village.
It takes a village in a world most of the time.
Hey, you touched upon some of the challenges that the agency's faced in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think there have been some opportunities too, and telehealth has certainly been probably one of the primary pieces of this whole thing, that if there's a silver lining to what we've been through, that might be one of them. Can you talk about the advantages of telehealth and then maybe how that might impact the future of behavioral health, community-based behavioral health care long term?
Yeah, sure. When it comes to telehealth, it's been one of those venues to provide services, different types of services for the last several years. And I will say, as a therapist, I've always struggled with, well, how would that work? Because so much of what we do in providing therapy to individuals is that personal relationship. It's being able to read body language. It's being able to be in the room with someone and sit through that pain that they're going through and challenge them around that. And so I was often curious about how that would work through telehealth, web-based platforms. I was surprised and shocked at our agency's ability to adapt to that model and continuously engage clients around services. Because I thought not only would it be a struggle for therapists, but it would also be a struggle for the individuals seeking services. But to my surprise, the agency was able to jump on board quickly. We had the technology to do that. Not only did we have the technology, I think our staff had the passion to make sure that they reached out to clients and clients had access to good treatment. So I think that passion kind of, for lack of a better phrase, kind of pushed us head first into it. And then as an agency, we tried really hard to identify some resources for staff to use to get comfortable with it. And probably after the first 2 weeks of the COVID-19 crisis hitting, we saw a dip in services. But as soon as we got the telehealth systems up and running, our appointments, our no-shows started really telling us that this is a viable option, and it's much needed, not only during times of this pandemic, but we started thinking about, as we work with individuals who live in very rural settings, it was a great way to connect with people who struggle with transportation. You and I were in a meeting with Senator Kane not long ago, where I advocated, hey, even after this pandemic's over, there's benefits to telehealth. And I hope that the MCOs and others would continue to allow us to provide services that way. We've seen a huge difference in the amount of no-shows, where people struggle to get to a clinic for outpatient services or psychiatric services. They typically would no-show because of the lack of transportation, or maybe it was even the lack of childcare. But through telehealth, those no-shows have really decreased. It's been amazing to kind of watch. So hopefully after the pandemic's over, the regulatory agencies will see the need, and this is a viable option for us to continue to provide adequate mental health.
Well, I mean, in our part of the world, the issue of transportation has kind of been the albatross of human services. And this was sort of forced upon us, I suppose you could say. But I think we're beginning to see the fruits of those efforts early on.
I do see the pros and cons of this alternative. And as we talked about the pros, I'll just briefly mention some of the things that we're concerned about through, by providing services through telehealth. Some of the concerns revolve around isolation. When you're dealing with people who are depressed or have anxiety, or people struggling with substance use disorders, sometimes that isolation impacts those symptoms and can make them worse. And so we've been trying to figure out how can we alleviate some of those stressors, some of those symptoms in an environment where we're primarily providing services through telehealth. I will say that we have a strong peer center, peer services, where individuals can reach out with to others who have struggled through some similar issues and have been able to manage them and be successful. So our peer services, what they've been challenged to do is figure out how to provide chat rooms or group activities through telehealth. And that's been well received. It's not perfect, but it's at least another strategy to try to accommodate and meet the needs of the individuals out there.
You mentioned the the issue with isolation, I was actually going to ask you, in the wake of the pandemic and everything that's going on, what's your biggest concern from a behavioral health standpoint as we phase out of the stay-at-home orders and that kind of thing?
I've been really concerned, and I've talked to some other colleagues and staff here at the organization. I think that we can project and probably guesstimate what this pandemic's going to do for the long haul, what kind of impact it's going to have on folks, their mental health. But it's still one of those unknowns. I worry a lot about children and how this has impacted them. So much of what we do every day, Mike, is based on relationships and interacting with people. And so when you're isolated, it can have some long-lasting, damaging effects. I think that's one reason you see a lot of people kind of struggle with the whole stay-at-home order. We need human contact. And I think the lack of human contact during this pandemic or not having social outlets is going to have a huge impact down the road, or that's what I'm scared of. You know, schools provide so many different types of functions beyond education for youth in our world. It's a way for them to socialize, develop social skills, interact with people, exercise, all those things, even get a good healthy meal. Mm-hmm. And without those, what's happening? And I think, you know, I'm not saying that parents can't provide care for their children. They can't do what they need to do to try to educate them at home. But most of our parents in our society today, you know, we're working, sending their children to school. So it's been a huge adjustment on children and families. Yeah. And so, you know, I kind of worry about that.
Mm-hmm. And you think that's something that we could be dealing with for months, if not years on end, right?
I do. And I think, you know, I've often said that, you know, dealing with this pandemic has been very stressful. It's not like a natural disaster where, you know, a storm rolls in, a tornado or a flood, and then it's over and you start picking up the pieces to recover. This has been so different because there's not a known end date. Right. There's not a known kind of recovery process. You know, we're still grappling with what's the fall going to look like? Is there going to be a vaccine? Mm-hmm. All those uncertainties weigh heavy on people. I read something just the other day where there's been a spike in folks struggling with sleep. You know, and that tells me that folks are really anxious. Yeah. And it's very hard for them to find some peace and some relaxation during these times.
It's a new world, to say the least.
It is a new world.
If you had a chance to speak to the community and share one thing with them, one point that you'd like to get across, what would that be?
Just one point that I would like to get across. That's really hard because there's so many things I want to say. I think I would, if I had to boil it down to one thing, it's have hope. I think hope is what sustains us. Hope is what helps us get to the next day. And I say this frequently with the staff here at River Valley Community Services is, yes, it is hard and these are uncertain times, but we have to find hope. And for me, I find hope in just watching people interact and do things for each other, reach out and try to meet the needs of others, whether it's taking groceries to someone who's shut in, whether it's opening the door for someone, or just the common act of wearing a mask while you're out in public. I find hope in those simple things, and that's what helps me get through, and I believe that's what would help others get through these challenging times. Instead of focusing on all the uncertainties, try to find the hope in your day-to-day activities. We're not struggling with this in isolation. You know, we're not the only ones who are scared, who are fearful, who find it difficult to do our daily activities. There's others out there. And so we're not alone. And if we're struggling, reach out to one another, have those discussions, talk to people about what you're feeling and what you're struggling with, and look for the hope.
Well said. There's a lot of unrest right now with the issue of race and law enforcement. And obviously, those paths intersect a lot with the behavioral health world. Can you speak to just the current state of what we see in our community as far as interaction with law enforcement and dealing with folks who are experiencing behavioral health issues?
Sure. I think the unrest that we've seen play out across the country on social media and through our television sets, I think that's just added to these uncertain times.
Mm-hmm.
For me personally, it's been a challenge to watch. Growing up, I've witnessed things change over the years. I've witnessed our country become more accepting of individuals who have differences. I really thought that we had made more progress, and obviously we have. So it's been a struggle for me. As a white male, sometimes, I find myself struggling and not understanding. I don't know what it's like. I can only imagine what it's like to be a different color and struggle being a parent, trying to educate our children on how to respond to systems that are supposed to take care of us and protect us.
Right.
And that maybe we're judged just based on our skin tone.
Mm-hmm.
It's been very challenging. But going back to something that we were talking about earlier, I try to find the hope in the day-to-day. And I think my hope right now is because these issues have been brought to light, so to speak, that gives me hope that now we can address them. We've identified the simple fact that we haven't made as much progress as we had hoped. And so now we need to figure out how we can roll up our sleeves and do more work. When it comes to our community, I know that there's individuals out there who struggle with the perception of law enforcement or the perception with race and what does these events really mean? I think struggle's a good sign, because if you're struggling with it, that means you're thinking about it.
Right.
And if you're thinking about it, hopefully through conversations, we can figure out a path forward. I think we're very fortunate in our area to have some of the leaders in our law enforcement agencies because they understand it. I'll go back to something we talked about earlier. We partner a lot with our law enforcement agencies. And even though they represent a different field than behavioral health, they're open to hearing us talk about what folks struggle with and how we might tailor our interventions in order to get a better response. You're aware that we offer programming for our law enforcement around how to deal with people with mental health issues and behavioral health issues. And that platform has really allowed us to continue to develop our partnership and challenge each other about how our systems work and how we interact with the different individuals and the different populations in our community. So I'm hopeful there. Do I think we're perfect? No. Do I think we have work to do? Yes. But I would say that no matter where we are,
Right.
We always have to evaluate what we're doing and how we're doing it in order to improve. I joke with most people, and you may have heard me say this, I don't believe in A pluses. I always think that there's work to be done, and we can always do something to improve how we're providing services or how we're interacting with individuals.
Yeah. I know you're an avid reader, so I'm curious to learn what you're reading right now.
Well, lately it's been a lot of newspapers.
I get it.
It's been really hard to stay up on some of the information related to COVID-19 because early on the information seemed to change day by day.
Right.
And what was expected of us. So a lot of my focus has been on trying to read and stay up on the knowledge that's been developed. Other than that, there's a book. I can't think of the title right now, but it's by Jeff Tweedy. I've been reading.
Okay.
Who is in a band known as Wilco, and it's pretty much his story and struggle, not only as an artist but as someone who has suffered from some behavioral health issues.
Oh, okay. Okay. Hey, do you have a recommended book that you would share?
Just one?
Just one. Or if you've got a couple, we'll take a couple.
That's tough because most people that know me know I'm not a big fiction reader. I kind of get bored with fiction after a while. I tend to go back to nonfiction quite often. I don't really want to go there, but I read a lot of books around politics. But one book over the years that has always stuck with me, and I can say it was probably a pivotal point in my life, was Black Elk Speaks.
Okay.
And it's an older book. I read it back in the late 80s as I embarked on an adventure where I worked on a Native American reservation in South Dakota. So as I was going and transitioning and doing that work on the reservation, I read this book, and it was pretty enlightening for me. It talked about, obviously a culture that was different than my own. It talked about people who suffered as a minority. It talked about how they dealt with assimilation. And so that's a book that's always stuck with me. And periodically I go back and reread it. It's one that I strongly encourage my daughter to read as a parent. But that book sticks out. It's one of my favorites, and I would recommend it to anybody.
Well, we'll include a link to that in our show notes for today. You mentioned your work with the Native Americans, and it brings to mind, again, some of the issues around racism and some of the other topics of the day, the LGBTQ community, those kind of things, and all those unique mental health challenges that each of those groups face. And then, too, here in the New River Valley, Central Appalachia, we've got our own culture. Can you speak to some of the challenges that come with serving this particular community?
Sure. As an outsider many years ago who moved to this area, and when I say this area, I'm talking about Southwest Virginia in general. I grew up around Charlotte, North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And after finishing my undergraduate degree, I moved to a very rural part of Southwest Virginia. I know that sounds funny because most of Southwest Virginia is rural, but I moved to Lee County. Mm-hmm. And I came with all my baggage, fresh out of school, wanting to do the right thing, wanting to help people. But I learned quickly that I had to figure out their culture. I had to understand their culture in a way that allowed me to communicate with them, to understand their background, and form a relationship that allowed me to challenge them and assist them through their daily lives and their struggles. And I think the same's true here. We have to understand the population we're serving. Mm-hmm. We can't assume that we know their pain. We can't assume that we know their way out of their pain. We have to recognize and appreciate their culture. And that's always been a big thing for me. Know who's sitting in front of you, whether you're trying to serve them as a client or they're just your neighbor. Try to understand them, understand how they develop their thinking patterns, how they celebrate life, how they deal with struggles. Get to know them. And I think so many times today we're very quick to assume things, and that gets us into a lot of trouble. I provide some clinical supervision, not as much as I used to in previous years, but that's the challenge I talk to folks who get into behavioral health is, yes, you've gone to school, yes, you've learned these theories and everything, but you have to take the time to get to know the person sitting in front of you. Don't assume anything. I think that's the first step in our work, getting to know who's in front of us and appreciating who they are.
I think that's a great word of advice to wrap up our conversation with.
Well, Mike, I've enjoyed this time. It really flew by.
It seems to do that when you and I get together.
Yeah. I hope you have a pleasant day, and I wish all the listeners well, and I hope that they can find hope in their day-to-day activities.
Thank you, James. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dissect and Connect podcast. To learn more about Montgomery County Prevention Partners or New River Valley Community Services, be sure to check us out on Facebook or visit nrvcs.org/podcast.